Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak and for all the presenters. I feel like I've learned a lot in the last couple of days, and they're perspectives that I rarely come across, so I really value this time. I'm going to be speaking today about using satellite imagery to study violent conflict. And these are going to be different kinds of images than I think most of us are used to. These are more environmental images. They're not the high-res kind of images you see in Google Maps or Google Earth. They're quite coarse, but they have other advantages that I'll be talking about. So I first want to start with Landsat 1. This was the first operational Earth-observing satellite launched in 1972. Most of the images we'll be looking at today are really from its descendants. One thing that may be striking about this satellite, especially to this audience, is just how brutally pragmatic its design was. It's as if there was no aesthetic judgment made in its construction whatsoever, stripped to its bare essentials of camera, solar panels, stabilizer, and communication system without any disco flair associated of the day. Since that launch, there have been 6 iterations of that satellite put into orbit. The most recent was 2013, and you can see in the lower left-hand corner, we have Landsat 7, and then we have Landsat 8. These are really the workhorses of environmental monitoring with satellites. These are systems operated by NASA exclusively, so there's a host of others operated by other agencies. And we have another one pending for 2020, which will give us a continuous archive spanning 50 years from its original launch in 1972. Here again, this is the same fleet in motion. There are, of course, hundreds of other government satellite orbits, untold numbers of spy satellites orbiting us all the time. The system we'll be talking most about today is, which is a Landsat system, orbits 705 kilometers overhead. That's about 430 miles. It makes a complete orbit every 99 minutes, makes 14 passes every day, and crosses every point on Earth once every 16 days. Now that last bit's especially critical for what I'll be talking about towards the end of the talk, how we can use this every 16-day operation to understand how the Syrian civil war unfolds over Aleppo. The value of remote sensing, and specifically these kind of satellites, for monitoring landscape change, it doesn't necessarily rest in the detail, the spatial detail of the images, but rather in the systematic nature and the geographic breadth of their collection. Most sensors have nominally global coverage and have a constant systematic perspective from which to image the Earth. The global view provided by this constellation of satellites opens up otherwise enclosed spaces. Here, a quote from a Libyan rebel colonel during the Arab Spring in 2011. He says, as rebel leaders continued, this is from New York Times article, as rebel leaders continued to plead for weapons along with communications and night vision equipment from abroad, they said that no foreign experts had been sent to help train their fighters. The only foreign expert we use is Google Earth, Colonel Bani said. However, as I think Ingrid Burrington will talk after my presentation at much more detail, the base map provided by Google Earth is artificial. It's a composite of aesthetically idealized but out-of-date images. And while it's updated with fresh imagery from time to time, it remains static. And here we have Aleppo from, right in the bottom right-hand corner, December 11th, 2015. This is the most recent image available on Google Earth 15 months ago. Now we're switching to an image from the first Gulf War, Kuwaiti oil fields on fire, also captured by the Landsat system. Even this image in its detail and visceral legibility of black plumes coming from burning oil wells during the first Gulf War does not provide the kind of perspective required for monitoring conflict, namely a perspective that is contextual, scale-dependent, and dynamic. This kind of image serves more as an anecdote than an account. The accumulation of images over time, on the other hand, helps us build evidence and potentially examine theory. Here we have the same event captured by an atmospheric satellite called Nimbus 7 that measures atmospheric aerosols. You'll see a flare-up over Kuwait start in May and June as this animation goes over. There it's flaring up. And really, this is not trying to detect that, but it all the same is captured as a regional anomaly and can be, contextualized in the broader understanding of both environmental and social consequences of that act. The awareness of the value in the long-term view of environmental conditions provided by satellite imagery is not new. As we can read here, as early as 1972, the very first year that Landsat was even in orbit, it was being used to estimate the condition and extent of the Soviet Union's wheat crops. Now, I think this is a fairly passive presentation of what was going on, describing wheat prices and how the US sold wheat to the Soviet Union and then bought it back at a loss. The real story is that the US was monitoring Soviet Union's crops for a long time, right, as an indicator of state stability. Having this information or this intelligence does not necessarily translate to action, despite the breadth of data. If we turn back to Syria, as we all know, the drought in the region has been posited as a destabilizing factor that contributed to the onset of the Syrian civil war. While the spatiality and specific intensity of the drought could not be well predicted, the effects of the drought on the Syrian populace did not come as a surprise to Syrian nor American leadership. In 2001, 10 years before the Syrian civil war began, a report from the World Bank stated, "The Syrian government will need to recognize that achieving food security with respect to wheat and other cereals in the short term, as well as the encouragement of water-intensive cotton, appear to be undermining Syria's security over the long term by depleting available groundwater resources." So this is 10 years before the civil war began. We have imagery from that 10 years before the civil war began, March 2001. Here we have a satellite-derived map of anomalies in vegetative condition. So green areas suggest better conditions than normal. Brown and red suggest worse conditions. Now, as we go forward towards the war using these images, we see that we have extensive and abundant data to monitor the drought. It wasn't until 2007 that the drought actually began. It ended up lasting 3 years, and by one study was the most intense drought in the Mediterranean for the last 900 years. We have this abundance of satellite data to monitor the drought, to identify which communities were hardest hit, which would likely be displaced as a result, but very little action was taken on this at the international level. In the same year, 2007, the UN Security Council held its first ever debate on the impact of climate change on peace and security, calling for a, quote, long-term global response to deal with climate change. This was still 4 years before the war began. In 2008, Syria imported wheat for the first time in 15 years, and an official appeal to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization by the Syrian agricultural minister identified that economic and social fallout from the drought was, quote, beyond our capacity to deal with. Still 3 years before the war. US generals eyeing this region for regime change did not respond to these calls. By 2011, the drought had dissipated. We still see some remnants, especially in northeastern Syria, of very low agricultural condition. The drought had dissipated, but the crops did not return. Whole communities had already left their villages and farms. There was no one left to tend to these fields, and those who had relocated to the cities carried this trauma with them. The record of the collapse of the Syrian state's legitimacy is recorded in part in its crops and continues today in the rubble of its major cities. Now, in March 2011, military troops opened fire on protesters across Syria, killing 38 people in the first week. In the nearly 6 years since the start of the war, we have generated an abundance of data to assess the spatiality of this war. We have multiple complementary perspectives, including geolocated conflict incidents and deaths, which is what I'm mapping here, from one specific data set, locations and changes in control, territorial control, which I'll show after this, and infrastructural damage, which is the last section. Individually, and in a more powerful sense collectively, these spatial perspectives intimate a process of violent conflict, a spatially explicit conflict chronology with attendant patterns of change. And as we go through these different databases, we'll see the spatial and temporal scales of representation vary and offer these distinct insights into the manifestation of the war. So now we've zoomed in to the Aleppo governorate. We see the distribution of the same data, conflict events recorded. Now I can overlap that with territorial control data, which has been collected from the Carter Center. This gives us a more spatially detailed perspective on changes in territorial control. For each location, we have monthly information for the last 2 years over which group, ISIS, Assad's regime, opposition, kind of an anonymous opposition, and the Kurdish Peshmerga, who was in control at all of these locations every month for about the last 2 years. And you can see with the data in the background still visualized, these are quite different perspectives on where is the war, what's happening from the war, how do we measure the war. We zoom into Aleppo proper. We, again, are presented with a different kind of context to understand the manifestation of conflict and also our ability to monitor its progression. Going to switch to a third data set, which again shows even a finer detail scope of now infrastructural damage collected by UN analysts as a group called UNOSAT, who does amazing work across the world on numerous conflicts and disasters. These are visually interpreted sites of significant damage against a cartography of the road network in Syria, or in Aleppo. These kinds of data are traditionally collected by taking one image collected at one time, such as this image in Kobani, northern Syria in September 2014, and then comparing that to another image taken hopefully very soon after in an ideal setting like the next day to identify visible changes. And what your eye is probably trying to grab onto right now looking at these differences, you're identifying texture, tone, structure. These kinds of changes are really due to the amount of the reflections pattern of light off of these features. If nothing else, we're just detecting brightness, darkness, absence of shadow, presence of shadow. Taken together then, we have different perspectives on this war, from the first countrywide database on conflict to the territorial control to the visually interpreted satellite image derived data. They have different temporal scales, different spatial scales. They go from daily to annual and from settlement level to infrastructural level. Now, a challenge with using the most detailed of these spatially, which is the infrastructure level UNOSAT data, is that it's annual collection. We know that the causes of violent deaths in Syria, not only are they happening throughout the year, not just year by year, the kinds of violent deaths, the kinds of manifestations of conflict also change over the course of the war. So by engaging with the open access data set, the environmental remote sensing approach, we aren't necessarily confined by the same annual perspective, but can instead collect, in the case of Aleppo, 258 images collected every 16 days. In this case, going 5 years before the war began to generate a baseline understanding of conditions in Aleppo, carrying it through all the way to the end of 2016. With this temporally dense set of observations, we can capture short-term as well as protracted change and critically ephemeral effects of violent conflict that would otherwise be lost. So if we start looking at our anecdotal base map comprised of multiple satellite sensor images here, pulled directly from, this is actually a different kind of base map, but similar data is used in Earth Engine. We can transition to one of these open access images. Now I have a bit of a vignette here around. This is a 20-kilometer radial extent surrounding Aleppo. The data that I'm showing here are 15 meters. So a single pixel is 15 meters by 15 meters on the ground. It's also panchromatic, so that's literally all colors. It means all colors of visible light are compressed to a single reflectance value. And in that way, we can interpret these images much like we would black and white film. We have 258 dates to choose from. I'm choosing 3 in succession: July 4th, July 20th. I'm choosing those images mainly because they're cloud-free. They're good to give examples right now. Dealing with clouds is a consistent challenge here. we need to have a cloud-free observation to detect what's going on in the city. And I've generated, just as a bit of a reference point here, an image showing the aggregate view of clouds over Aleppo. So imagine isolating every cloud in every satellite image, compositing them together into a single image showing the density of clouds. That's more or less what we have here, with darker pixels suggesting more persistent clouds, and the darkest pixels having clouds about 50% of the time. So what's interesting here is we're already seeing how the city relates to its landscape. Agricultural fields around Aleppo are more regularly clouded due to the evaporation of water from the crops during the rainy season and following irrigation, whereas the built-up area in Aleppo doesn't have the same kind of evaporation effect. So we have less clouds accumulating. Good for us for looking at urban images. Now, when we zoom into Aleppo, we have a view of a bit of a cloud-free corridor over the city through which we can image changes over time. Going back to the original time series, June 18th, 2013, we're looking at a scale that's similar to what you would see from 7 kilometers above Aleppo, though very pixelated, right? We can make out road networks. This is a city park here. Perhaps we can identify the citadel there. I'm sure to most of you it looks really like a bad image, right? But these kinds of images allow us to detect subtle changes that happen across the city. We can identify hotspots of change at different times. Most of these changes that we will see are going to be very low magnitude. And these kinds of low-level background change with the absence of a building, a change in shadow being cast on an intersection, for example, these are normally considered, they're so small magnitude, they're considered noise in a traditional remote sensing analysis. But the characterization of these very low-level changes is central to the study here. So now I went ahead to July 4th, 2013, and let's go ahead again to July 20th. I'm not sure if I flip back and forth if there's going to be any dramatic change between these at all, right? Now I've done an assessment here comparing the two. We see broadly grayscale, but we see some cyan, we see some red. These images that are cyan or teal are areas that were brighter in the second date of the image, so brighter in July 4th than June 18th. Red, on the other hand, would be darker. So some of these brighter areas could be an accumulation of rubble over darker soil. It could be an absence of a shadow from a collapsed building. Darker areas in red here could be scorched land. They could be lighter soil being displaced to reveal the more saturated, darker soil underneath. We have a whole range of different conditions that could contribute to these. But since we're right in the middle, 2 years into the Civil War, we have some confidence that taken as a whole, when we see systematic changes, these aren't just ephemeral changes due to the general course of action within a city, but actually related to the conflict. In the next change pair, we see a similar kind of distribution. Again, very low-level changes. We can see at the north-central section of the image, especially a road network that looks illuminated in cyan. This, to me, my interpretation would be there's damage at that roadway. Now, by sequentially mapping areas of significant damage every 16 days, we can generate an image of cumulative damage from which the pattern of violence emerges. So this is basically, again, I know it's a bit abstracted, but we'll transition to more interpretable in a moment. These bright areas are areas that have the greatest density of change. These are areas that were frequently damaged at high frequency over the course of the war. When we see small changes build up over and over and over every 16 days, we start seeing that there's a systematic and repetitive focus of damage in certain areas. In this approach, every pixel is important in mapping the pattern so that we can collect them as a whole and view them collectively. Al-Quds Hospital glows in this map, given to the fact that it was damaged more than almost any other place in central Aleppo. 20% of the time, in fact, it was damaged. And this is the kind of damage on the ground that you would see. Zooming back a bit at a broader scale, we see the spatiality of the civil war in Aleppo. This is same product from the last image, but now highlighted in orange. This approach, which is sensitive to ephemeralities and socio-spatial disparities, presents a countermap not only to Assad or coalition forces, but also to traditional applications of satellite-based methods. As such, I hope its perspective serves as a reference map for potential post-conflict peace building. And in working with these images, from a personal perspective, it's been challenging to deal with these images and not to detach from the reality of these on-the-ground experiences, but rather to use the value that we can see in these images to provide the I'm hoping, emotionally rich through a sort of spatial empathy lens that only the satellite can provide. Thanks very much.